So in this presentation, I want to answer the question, is there a future for vertical farming? Now, my prediction based on my research is that leafy greens in the next 5 years can definitely be economically grown in vertical farms, at least in America. And you can expect to see a lot of leafy greens which can be stacked to be indeed vertically farmed in Western nations. Soft fruits and vegetables may come into play over the next 10 years, but it's structurally much harder, and the requirements for these soft fruits and vegetables are more intense and less suitable for vertical farming. But you will likely see them in the next 10 years. Whereas staples, which make up a large portion of our diet, will unlikely ever be grown vertically farmed unless there's the application of genetically engineered solutions. So I'm putting that as a 20-year possibility. Now, let's dive into what exactly is a vertical farm before we weigh up the economics and do a deeper dive. So a vertical farming is fundamentally a intensification solution in which the crops being grown on a per unit space can have higher yields through stacking. Now you can see that in the image, in that small, roughly half meter by meter, you have 7-8 levels of crops. So you can grow much more in that unit of space. The other key characteristic of a vertical farm is there's no soil. You can see that in the image. And the reason for this is that soil is fundamentally used for support, structural support, but also for collecting nutrients. But when you can just spray these on with an aeroponic mist or have them within the solvent in a hydroponic system, which we'll talk about later, it's not necessary. So this is a cost-saving technique, and also you don't get any soil bound diseases. The other characteristic is to, in essence, replace the sun. You need LEDs, light emitting diodes, to provide the energy, and but because they're indoors, there's no pesticides, which are proved very harmful. So you'll see often purple light being used, and this is fundamentally or primarily a cost-saving technique in which red and blue light are the wavelengths most needed for plant growth. So they cut out what you'd see other colors that you would get in just a normal white, all-inclusive LED. There's been debate that certain things like soft fruits, like strawberries, need green light, but for lettuce and the leafy greens being grown now, you generally just need purple light, red and blue. Now, let's discuss some more of the advantages. So on a traditional farm, irrigation costs are growing. There's less space needed, as we discussed in a vertical farm. You can grow the crops all year round because you can dictate the environment. That's very critical. In a vertical farm, you control the inputs in the environment: CO2, water, sunlight, fertilizer, etc. And you can increase the speed and per unit yield with optimization of light and these components. You can lower transportation costs by growing food in warehouses, as we saw, which are closer to the ultimate consumer. Then there's no pesticides and less fertilizer needed. The crops are tasty and fresh. Often you can adjust the wavelengths and the frequency of light applied to these plants to have a much different taste and a much more preferable taste, which is more nutritious. and you can increase efficiency with water saving. But with every group of advantages, you often get a cohort of, let's say, cohort of disadvantages. And these include that natural sun has to be replaced, which is through LEDs, which is energy intensive, and we'll see that. The initial cost to capital is extremely high. The labor cost is substantial, as we're at the start of the innovation curve, as people may call it. And the learning curve is steep. The technology involved is advanced, and many foods in farming, traditional farming, are heavily subsidized, which make the transition, if the transition is right and economic, harder. Now, because there's some market failure with the subsidies now allowed. Now, we understand what vertical farming is, and we understand predictions. Why are we even talking about vertical farming? So let's dive deeper into this through assumptions which are made about vertical farming. Now, right before we do that, the core reasons why we're talking about this is because there's pressure from population growth, from climate change, and less weighted factor is, but still relevant, especially in the Western world, is urbanization. By 2050, we'll have about 2/3 of people in urban areas who are wealthier, demanding more nutritious, high quality, more fresh food, and they'll pay a premium for that. So let's talk about these assumptions for vertical farming, and it will allow you to understand further why I've made the predictions of really only getting leafy greens in there as a short-term vertical farming output and economically viable output. Now, one assumption is that vertical farming will solve world hunger and adapt Africa to climate change. This is completely false. It is too expensive. African nations cannot pay the premium to afford the initial capital costs. There certainly is food insecurity, which will grow in Africa. There's 1 billion people who are food insecure. Very few in the West and very few in America, but it's certainly an issue which will become harder with climate change and a growing population. But it costs, most of the estimates and the costs which have been seen with already existing vertical farms, cost around $80 million for the initial cost of equipment and building. And these largely come from building itself with the substructure and chromic glass shell, and other things like energy infrastructure and the automation systems are hugely expensive. So in conclusion, Africa will not be adopting vertical farm, at least in the short term, in its most complete sense. It's going to be a Western thing, if anything, where the premium can be paid initially. Now, another assumption is vertical farming will be a solution to population growth. We've already established Africa will not be adopting vertical farming because of the economics. But this is false. America has no population pressure. Now, it is true, based on current waste in production, food production will have to double to feed the 9.5 billion people estimated, and that's conservative, which will be there in 2050. But looking at this estimated world population in 2050, what you can see is all of this population growth is stemming from Asia and Africa. The last census in America was flat, completely flat. So there's no population pressure. That's not going to be the driver of adoption of vertical farms in America. So the third assumption, vertical farming, people say vertical farming doesn't make sense because there's lots of arable land left. A simple solution, if we're struggling to grow crops, why don't we just use an extensification solution in which we just create more farms? Well, it's false. there's almost no arable land left unless we stop eating livestock or deforest. So doubling crop production would require clearing 1 billion hectares of land. And this would contribute to 10% of total CO2 emissions currently, agricultural related land use change. And this would drastically enhance that awful effect for the world. So while you might read that there is actually 65% of arable land left, it's not really true. When you break it down further, you see 15% of this is protected or settled, and 45% is would have to be deforested. So what you really get is about 20%, and this 20% is not taking into account that the best land is already being used. So I would estimate it's roughly around 10% of available arable land actually could be used. So in conclusion, there's practically no space to grow crops. So if you want to increase yield, you have to go in a sustainable way, in an intensification solution oriented direction. And this really shows that you could potentially do extensification if you reduced the land we use for livestock, but trends show that a decline in consumption of livestock is not really occurring at a fast rate. So we need to go for intensification. Now, the final real assumption is climate change will worsen, making the economics of vertical farming and the need for new farming methods more viable. This is true, but it's true in the sense that it will make some crops, like vegetables and crops which Western nations import, much more viable, but not for certain staples like corn, which will actually adapt very well to initially to climate change. Now, what you can see here is America is certainly not excluded from the climate change impact. On the bottom left, you can see the number of droughts in California, and you can see the frequency increase over the last 30 odd years. And just in 2016, 2021, 8,000 jobs were estimated to be lost, with a $7 billion emergency funds required for the drought. So this is really having an impact on farmers in terms of jobs and money. So this may push and is likely to be the driver pushing vertical farmers into place. And imports are a big part of US consumption, and disproportionately the areas in the tropics will be affected by climate change, and soft fruits, which Americans are increasingly importing, will be affected. So you may well see these being vertically farmed in the next 10 years, as discussed. So the real question, is vertical farming a more economically and socially effective way to farm? And we know that outside of just this direct comparison of the economics, we need to factor in how climate change and changes to other farming inputs will affect the economic competitiveness, because it won't be population driving it. It won't fundamentally be urbanization. It will be climate change and the general economics. Economics will drive change. So let's look at an understanding of a traditional farm to one of a vertical farm. Let's start with the traditional one, because we've looked at the vertical farm, and then do a crop to crop analysis. That's the best way to understand viability and future viability. Now, the average farm is 450 acres. That is what a general farm in terms of space looks like. And one of the key components is water. Now, farmers generally get their water from groundwater. You see groundwater is below the surface, or surface water, and it's split roughly 50-50. You can see that on the table of acre feet applied. Now, let's look at the cost for that in a second. but generally traditional farms are pressurized, irrigated now. Gravity irrigation is susceptible to large amounts of evaporation, so super ineffective. But pressurized irrigation is still very ineffective, but it's used 80% on 80% of farms in America. Now, surface water and groundwater generally cost $32 and $41 respectively. So on a 450-acre farm, you're looking at an expenditure of about $16,000, whereas water is used far more sparingly and recycled in aeroponics and hydroponic systems, which are generally used in current vertical farms. And so 5% cost comparatively is $800. So practically negligible. So you can see the real advantage of water in a vertical farm. So let's really dive deep into a comparison of a single crop, which is lettuce, and make a prediction on when cost parity and the viability will be reached and the viability. So this really interesting study came out, comprehensive study or titled "The Economics of Vertical Farms" by two professors, one in the Massachusetts University and Texas State University. And I want to make this clear. It was a unit to unit comparison. Vertical farms are advantageous through scale. Scale is critical. But in this paper, they looked at a relative profit margin of a traditional farm versus a vertical farm. And so in the COGS, cost of goods sold, and the cost of production, they looked at the cost of labor, the cost of energy, the rent cost, water cost, and then the revenue was the regional price. And they did what they called a location appeal. And before we conclude that Austin is the best, I want you to, and it's worth looking at. All of these are negative and significantly negative. And what can one take from this? It's the fact that on a unit to unit comparison, vertical farming is uncompetitive and highly uncompetitive, generally over 20% uncompetitive. And they even included in the cost of production things like insurance as a proxy of risk and growing risk. So you can see that the profit margin just on a unit to unit basis is 200% greater than vertical farming. But however, the profit margin is a low dollar amount. Don't necessarily take in the percentage as something very critical. And volume makes an impact on the economics, because although a fully vertically integrated traditional farm might make a 200% profit margin before shipping, is not a large nominal amount of money, which makes it scale more attractive. And that's where vertical farming really succeeds. So let's do a deeper dive on what they broke down the costs of production more deeply. And you can see where vertical farming flounders on a cost per cost, unit to unit basis. And this is fundamentally on a labor cost. It's going to require automation. And it's also with energy. We're going to really need renewable energy sources to drive the price down, and LEDs to become cheaper and more efficient to become more cost competitive. But you can see that water, and as that grows with the effects of climate change, will make vertical farming much more competitive. And then land costs were just seen as somewhat of a sunk cost, so it was practically even. But you can see the cost, the price of lettuce about $1.9. And see that the average production of vertical farm costs about 1.4 to 0.6 in the like traditional farming. And the study didn't include transportation, and there was limited consideration of startup costs. I want to have make sure that's kept in mind. A really interesting study, which like now you'll be able to see why vertical farming can make a real indent on the plates of food we eat. And the title is Up and Away. And what it remember, we're focusing on lettuce here, but I want to focus on the right-hand side of this this table. And what it shows is in a vertical farm on a commercial scale, 37 floors with a 10,000 meter square base, you can see that a lot of crops can have a 500 factor increase through stacking and technology, with lettuce being over 700. And that's enormous. So you can really see that vertical farmings prove economic at scale, not on a unit-to-unit basis. So what I did was, there's a lot of analysts state that you can get a 500 factor increase, but I wanted to do a sensitivity analysis. So I looked at the return at 50x, 100x, and 500x. And at what acreage is the revenue parity to a traditional farm? And you can see that at 500x, it's only 2 acres needed because of the increased yield. Obviously, a traditional farm, the yield stops at 450 acres, where because of the intensification, you can get much more in a vertical farm. So you would need 2 acres, 10 acres, and 20 acres at those factor increases. Now, this is what a 2-acre farm would look like. So if it was 500 x factor increase, that is what you could see as a future vertical farm. And it's plausible. It's big, but it's not terribly disastrously, in quotation marks, enormous. Now, if you were, so that would be a 5-floor, a 1-floor warehouse. But if it was 100x or 50x increase, you would see 5 floors and 10 floors respectively. So you could look at this image and say, right, adding 10 floors, 5 floors, it becomes really enormous and almost maybe implausible, but somewhat imaginable. Now, at the 500x factor increase of 8 floors, the output of a traditional farm would yield around 4,500 tons. Now, with increased efficiency, and because you can grow year round, you could assume that 10,000 tons of lettuce could be produced per year, giving an operating profit, not revenue, of $3.5 million. Now, we looked at the fixed cost and the initial capital cost being 80 million. So take the 3.5 million yearly profit, so contribution margin, which excludes the fixed costs, then you get 20 years to break even. Now you do this over a 30-year time period, you can get somewhere around about 10% to 15% return on investment. So it does seem plausible to grow lettuce economically at scale. You need this scale, but it's highly, highly contingent on debatable factors like electricity cost. Now you can see just a simple thing like electricity. We also looked at labor, could be really decisive on if vertical farming is actually economic. Now, a lot of studies say it's about 780 to 3,500 kilowatts per hour per meter squared. Now, this would be $6 million. So you can see all the profits would be practically wiped out if it was this expensive. So at about $0.2 per kilowatt. But a lot of studies show also that it could be about 65 kilowatts per hour per month, and that would bring it down to about 1.5. So a huge range there. But if it's at that lower range, it's economically viable. I've broken it down to the main cost and revenue. So with the 10,000 tons at $1.9 per kilogram, you get $90 million of revenue. And excluding the building and equipment costs we looked at, with electricity at 2 million, so you've got 17 million, water and transportation at 1 million, 16 million, labor costing about 9 million, so you've got 7 million. Then you come down with fertilizer at 4 million. You're roughly, as a conservative, actually a lenient estimate, about $1 million to $3 million. So after you pay your commission, you get your commission from the groceries, because not everything's vertically integrated. A farmer might make around $1 million selling lettuce if everything's optimized. But that excludes the building and equipment, which we talked about. And so you can see it's almost there economically for something like lettuce. But how will changes in electricity, fertilizer and water and transportation change this? So what has changed in the past few years? What will the trend for farming inputs be? Fertilizer has absolutely rocketed through the roof for numerous reasons, which will likely persist. And vertical farms are much more efficiently structured so they use far less fertilizer. So they'll have a cost advantage here. Now, something called the Heights' law, which states that costs will decline every decade by a factor of 10, and light emitted by diodes will increase by a factor of 20. So that's makes vertical farming much more economic over time. Natural gas prices are skyrocketing, and irrigation pumping is much more expensive in transportation now, and that's on the assumption that vertical farms will use renewable sources. Now, this interesting study shows what could happen to costs of energy for irrigating as natural gas prices rise. So as climate change gets worse, the groundwater depth has increased a lot, and they're looking at Agala aquifer, sorry if I pronounce that wrong, which is all through Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, and New Mexico. And as groundwater depth has increased, energy requirement has drastically increased. But this would prove damaging. But over what you'd expect as energy requirement increases, costs of pumping would increase. But in fact, it's decreased. And that's largely because natural gas prices have decreased and been really low over the course of the last decade or so. But this is changing now. So it's going to have a much greater impact on traditional farmers as climate change takes effect. So why will it be hard for vertical farming to go beyond leafy greens in the next 5 years? We proved it's practically economic, and farming inputs will become the change in farming inputs will make vertical farming even more attractive in the future at scale. Well, it's going to be very difficult because much of our diet cannot be stacked. 70% of our crops come from, our food energy comes from like staples. And you can see from the images, apples and large staples just cannot be stacked and need things like seasons and wind. Crops like root vegetables need more light and space, but they can be stacked. Other crops can't demand a premium for freshness, like basil or lettuce. And certain crops take more time than leafy greens, reducing the yield advantage. So this is why it's going to be very hard or harder to move to that soft fruit and other vegetables, but it's possible. certainly. With climate change and economics becoming more competitive, vertical farms, you could really see this in the next 10 years, that some of these vertical farms, these crops switch. Now, 70%, as mentioned, does come from staples, but it's worth asking why wheat is even one meat at all. And it's because of competitive need for these for wheat to grow tall to gain sunlight. It's a natural competition. But Norman Borlaug invented the semi-dwarf wheat during the Green Revolution. So one may ask the question, if we can genetically engineer further, if it's allowed, maybe we can eventually stack wheat as climate change gets worse. But until then, we can only vertically farm economically somewhat of a small portion of our diet. You might see potatoes, but generally it's going to be vegetables and certain soft fruits, which can be stacked and are imported, because more than half of our food energy comes from 3 mega crops: wheat, corn, and rice. And that's why Jonathan Foley, an expert in sustainability, says vertical farms are growing the edge of the plate. So how can we improve efficiency? Oh, we'll need like machine learning and automation, and that will be the biggest driver of making vertical farming a reality for a lot of our foods. And IGS, a company, claims that recently, just in the past couple of years, they've been able, through the development of automation, reduce labor by 80% and power by 50%, two big disadvantages relative to traditional farming. So how it's going to really depend on how quickly machines and automation's prices can drop and automation be established. Can we get the initial cost of capital like warehouses to become cheaper? Can we repurpose some? So in conclusion, and answering the question, is there a critical path? That I think there certainly is. With in the next 5 years, we'll really see a lot of these leafy greens being vertically farmed and being able to be vertically farmed. And then as climate change worsens and technology improves, I think we'll see a lot of things like potatoes, so a lot of vegetables like potatoes, and a lot of things like tomatoes and strawberries will emerge and be vertically farmed. And then, unless we get CRISPR, I doubt we use CRISPR. I doubt grains and other fruits like apples and certain like nuts will ever be farmed. That's to be seen. I want to finish off talking about some alternatives to deal with these pressures of climate change and population which is facing our world, and also look at some expert comments. So Jonathan Foley stated that vertical farms are a round-off error in terms of contributing to big levers. These crops that can prevent famine. These are the crops which can prevent famine, like the mega crops such as wheat, not lettuce. And it's then on the contrary, Nate Story, who runs Plenty, who's a co-founder, says it's too early to criticize. What you're really seeing is a rush to profitability. And in fact, as crazy as it seems, it makes sense today. It makes sense as time goes on as well. And we've seen that with certain crops. In the UK, vertical farming is already there. More than half of the UK's basil requirement is grown through vertical farms already. And so it's happening. It is, and that's because it's a high margin crop, can be grown at scale, and a lot of other things we looked at, but it is occurring. The critical path is starting, but it's worth talking about other alternatives for for the population and climate change pressures. A lot of people think population is growing exponentially and food production grows linearly. This is Malthusian theory. And therefore we're headed for tragedy. That's not the case. We'll always have technological improvements that increase productivity. It just depends, it's just which technologies. And that's what the solar growth model shows. But what technologies will could potentially challenge vertical farming or be the solution? Well, we looked at water being an issue, but over 50% of Israel and Saudi Arabia's water already comes from desalination. Could we see more crop resistant seeds instead of vertical farming, cellularly grown meats and crops, other crops potentially, and just greater mechanization? And it's also, as a final note, worth stating that we currently produce enough food for 10 billion people. Waste and preservation is a massive issue. So thank you.